starting with, Liam, the official hiring of Vince Russo.
Yay!
You can tell too. Like obviously he had his fingerprints on the early episodes because he was like chipping in ideas and he was Jarrett's phone buddy. But like he's on board starting as of I think it's July 10th, and you can tell. You can certainly tell.
I was gonna say that makes sense because the first July pay-per-view was kind of absent of bullshit.
And even the second one, which by all accounts he had very little input on, number 4, and it's from 5 on that he starts having input. And 4 is probably the best of the bunch. It's the one we did the watch along. It's actually a very fun show, top to bottom. And then the bullshit starts coming in and you're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really funny because you can kind of tell, right? It's like 4, and even I think 5 was like a little bit of it. And then it just kind of shot downhill real quickly.
Because the other point we'll talk about, they went broke, but we'll talk about that as well in a second. But Vince Russo he returned to the WWF in late June, and it was very controversial. No one wanted him there, so he returned to WWF. There was rumors that he'd be like taking over Raw and SmackDown, and he'd be head of creative, and that didn't happen. And he was very, very, very quickly downgraded to just a consultant, where he would just chip in ideas and he would consult and he would read the scripts and he would watch the shows and then like critique them and offer notes while sitting at home. So he wasn't much a fan of that. So like
what everyone else does for free on Twitter.
Legitimately, it seems like a very good gig because Jerry Jarrett wrote in his book, Jeff called and advised that Vince Russo had declined his deal with WWE and come to work for us. WWE was offering him $125,000 per year to stay at home in Atlanta and watch the shows and serve as an advisor. Our offer is $100,000 and come to work full time in Hendersonville.
That's still so much money for fucking Vince Russo.
I know, especially when you consider this company is broke, which again we'll get into in a second. But this company is out of money, and they're like $100,000 for Vince Russo. That makes sense, right?
I mean, yeah.
But it's very funny that he returned to WWF and was immediately gone. It was like he was there for a week. He went to the offices like twice. Then he went home and he went back to TNA.
It's kind of like, you know, the blueprint for the TNA-WWE relationship moving forward, huh?
And it's quite interesting that there was a note on the website that Jerry Jarrett basically had to justify this hire because no one wanted Vince Russo there. Jerry Jarrett mentioned in his book that like reaction to Vince Russo being hired was 95% negative. So like there's a whole paragraph on the website. It's like, look, Vince Russo, he did well in the WWF. And he did badly in WCW. But I talked to JJ Dillon and I know why WCW went badly. So I understand it. And he deserves a shot. He's had 1 win and 1 loss, but the loss wasn't his fault. And I don't think Jerry actually believed this. If you read his book, I don't think he ever liked Vince Russo. I think he was hiring Jeff's friend. But fair play to him for getting out there and trying to make people not hate it.
Are Jeff and Vince still cool with each other?
Yeah. McMahon or Russo?
Russo.
Yeah, Russo. McMahon, not so much.
Well, they're obviously cool enough to the fact that they employ him.
Well, yeah, they're cool now, but it took a good, 15 years.
How can you be friends with Vince Russo? Especially, if you've employed him in any way.
Well, because when they worked together in WCW, Vince pushed him. So that does foster friendship.
Yeah, sure. But then he had, 10 years of bad. So maybe that outweighs it, huh?
Well, this wasn't in the 10 years of bad yet, though. This was only a year after WCW.
That's what I'm saying now, 2021. Jeff Jarrett, Vince Russo.
Oh, do you think they're still pals now? I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess they're probably still friends. There's nothing that would make them not friendly.
Besides the decade of terrible booking.
Yeah, but, I don't think Jeff is our friendship is over because he writes shitty angles.
I don't know. I would end my friendships if they wrote shitty angles.
It's like, how dare you be bad at creative in wrestling? There's other reasons to hate Vince Russo if you listen to all his podcast content, which, God forbid, why would you? But
says we, podcast all-stars and kings.
Yes, we are the arbitrators of good and bad podcasts. But yeah, Jeff Jarrett's like, you booked Jenna Maraska against Charmel. Friendship ended.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been the last straw for me, sure.
That's the point at which you will never talk to anybody again.
Mm-hmm. Because everyone would have booked that match.
We have Vinny Roo in the fold officially full-time. Another part of the reason Jerry Jarrett was okay with hiring him is, by all accounts, Jerry Jarrett was working very long days writing these shows. And he's like, I can't produce all these pre-tapes. I can't write all these shows. I do need extra help. And there's not a ton of qualified extra help in wrestling because, as illustrated in the history of wrestling, it's the same 10 people get these jobs over and over and over again. So People tend to fall back on the people they know, and they fell back on Vince Russo, who was also kind of already working for the company the whole time anyway.
They should have hired 5-year-old Liam Jones.
Oh yeah, and he can. What would you have booked for TNA? You probably would have still been high on Malice.
Yeah, well, as a kid, obviously, yeah. 5-year-old Liam, really into colors, so probably
Rainbow Express.
The Rainbow Express on top, yeah. And Jeff Jarrett with these very colorful pants.
Oh yeah, it was his blue combos, and I can't remember any other colors he wore in these shows other than the blue one, but I'm sure he wore other ones.
I think he wore black, so that kind of falls out part. But I imagine very quickly he would have learnt what appeals to the Book of Man. So,
Were you watching wrestling when you were 5?
See, as I've mentioned before on other less successful podcasts of ours, I don't remember like my specific beginnings in wrestling. I kind of just always knew about it. But if I had to think of like some of the earliest things I ever saw, probably would have been a couple years after this at this point. Like I have very vivid memories of early Victoria Stevie Richards stuff.
Oh, of course. Which would have been 03?
Yeah, so maybe just before I had started paying any attention. I could probably work it out via seeing when things started airing here and when. But yeah, I don't really know. I remember as a kid I went to a wrestling show very, very young. So actually no, I probably knew what wrestling was, but maybe not what WWE was.
Because I don't think I started watching wrestling until I was like 7-ish. Because the show I remember most vividly is SummerSlam 2000 as my earliest show, but I would have watched stuff before that. Because I remember Steve Blackman against Shane McMahon and Shane McMahon falling off stages. And I remember TLC. Or was it TLC? Yeah, it would have been TLC at that stage. So that's like the earliest I remember actively engaging with wrestling. But I'm sure I watched bits and bobs before that.
You know, it's going to be really funny.
What?
20 years from now when these kids have podcasts and they're like, I remember the first thing I saw in wrestling was The Fiend and the Fiendess.
No!
And I was hooked from the beginning.
No! It's like the Alicia against Melina Fox Tough Enough contestant, but it's going to be everybody.
Yeah, but like, you know, everyone gets into it at a certain point, I suppose. It's going to be really interesting seeing the kids who see stuff like AEW for their first experience.
Good wrestling, yes.
Yeah, it's going to be like, that's going to be like, we all think of the immediate reactions to having a major wrestling company again, right? That isn't shit. Mm-hmm. But we don't think about the long-term repercussions of this, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see what those fans end up turning into down the track. Because maybe like not my generation, well, not my generation because I was born in 97. So I guess like kids who were like 10 in 97, right? They would have seen more WCW than WWF here. Mm-hmm. WCW was bigger here.
So they would have been big fans of Goldberg, but not Steve Austin.
Probably because WCW toured here more. And if you ever talk to the older generation about wrestling, especially in Australia, that they will more often than not bring up WCW as like their point of reference than they will WWF.
That makes sense. Why they all do spears? Do they all do spears, Liam? Does everyone do a spear?
I think everyone who's into wrestling does a spear because it's the easiest thing to do and it's dope.
To be fair, if you're thinking about influence, is WCW more influential than WWF in general?
There's probably a case for it.
When you think of the wrestlers people always cite as inspirations, it's always people like Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio, and you very rarely hear people being like, oh, 98 Triple H is the guy I'm really trying to emulate here.
You could also probably say like structurally too, like just from a show's like point of view, the idea of, the cool heel like probably came from WCW, right?
Mm-hmm. That was kind of what the NWO were.
NWO peaked the highest, and like what was around first, like heel Vince McMahon or heel WCW authority figure? Eric.
It would have been Eric before Vince. Yeah, Eric would have joined the NWO before Vince was like a full-on heel on television.
So you could kind of quote, like, heel authority figure comes from WCW as well.
Which all bad things do trace back to Eric Bischoff, so that makes sense.
Yeah, so, there's probably a case for it, that, like, wrestling today is more heavily based off WCW than it is WWE. And that could also be said, just with the AEW influence as well.
Oh, can it be said about the TNA influence, though?
I don't know if it's, like, as big of a thing, but, like, TNA definitely does have an influence.
And, well, when you specifically look at the X Division, like, the Styles Daniels Joe generation probably were more influential than anything that happened in WWF at the time.
Yeah.
Like, to cite a specific example, Will Ospreay. Like, his inspiration is that era AJ Styles. So, what does WWE have?
And you're seeing more and more like tag teams come up and cite Motor City Machine Guns.
The women, a lot of them cite like the Knockouts as, this is why I saw myself actually doing this as wrestling instead of as, we'll talk about on these shows, sex objects.
Well, it's like, you got to think about it. Like, if they weren't watching like, Japanese women's wrestling, the jump in quality was basically like Lita, Trish, Knockouts. Because like that middle section wasn't really, flourishing.
You have to get the Gail Kim and Awesome Kong.
It's an interesting dynamic to think about. It's funny that we're like at that stage now. You know what I mean? Like, we used to hear everyone have these discussions about, earlier stuff, and then now it's starting to catch up where you're like, the Motor City Machine Guns probably are way more influential than people give them credit for.
They sure are. Even if you take out the wrestling, just in terms of how they look. Like, everyone started dressing like the Guns for like a decade.
Everyone bites off AJ and everyone bites off the Guns. Like, look-wise.
People who bring back the AJ Styles like 02 to 05 look.
The problem is, like, everyone jumped on the long tights AJ stuff.
I know. Everyone wears AJ tights these days. I don't like the AJ tights that much. Well, especially his modern tights. I like his like 09 tights. Those are cool.
I liked his tights for the most part up until like mid WWE stuff. Like, his later WWE stuff is like pretty bad. But like SmackDown Revival era AJ, sure.
So Vince Russo's back, as we were talking about. All that comes with Vince Russo is also back, as we'll also talk about when we start talking about these shows.